The Appalachian Mountains have a strange way of keeping secrets. The fog rolls over the hills like a curtain, softening everything it touches, hiding what shouldn't be seen. Deep inside those woods, where the trees grow close enough to block out the light, there's a silence that feels alive. It listens. It waits. And for years, it kept one of the deadliest families in American history hidden from the world. Before anyone knew their name, the Ridges were just another mountain family. They lived off the land in a small, weathered farmhouse that sat on the edge of a forgotten road in eastern Kentucky. The house leaned slightly to one side, its roof patched with rusted tin, its porch steps creaking under every footstep. From the outside, nothing about it looked strange. Chickens wandered near the woodpile, smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and an old hound dog lay half asleep in the dirt. But inside that house, something dark was always moving, quietly, patiently, like a sickness that didn't want to be found. It was the late 1980s, and the coal mines had already begun shutting down. The small towns scattered along the Appalachian ridges were struggling to breathe. Men were out of work, families were leaving, and the ones who stayed learned to make do with what they had. The Ridges were part of that group that never left. They were proud, hard people, suspicious of outsiders and loyal to their own. Folks in town said they were different, but nobody ever said it too loudly. Everyone knew better than to cross them. The family patriarch, Warren Ridge, was a man whom people rarely looked in the eye. He had a calm, unblinking stare that made others uneasy, like he was studying something you didn't know you were giving away. He was in his early 50s then, tall and strong despite years of labor, with a voice that could sound kind or cruel depending on what he wanted from you. Warren had worked in the mines until his lungs gave out, then turned to trading scrap and running small jobs around the county. But money alone was what made people respect him. It was fear. There was a quiet rumor that Warren could make problems disappear. A neighbor's missing dog, a feud that suddenly ended, a debt no one came to collect, nothing ever proven, of course, just talk. His wife, Ridge, was the opposite, soft-spoken, tired-looking, and always keeping her eyes down. She cooked, cleaned, and raised their children as if she were following an old script passed down from mothers before her. But there was something hollow in her smile, a kind of emptiness that people noticed and didn't ask about. The Ridges had 3 grown children, Caleb, Ruth, and Elijah. Each of them carried something from their father, his quietness, his temper, his sense that the world owed them more than it gave. Caleb, the oldest, had taken over most of the family's work after Warren's lungs failed. He was broad-shouldered, restless, and mean when he drank. Ruth, the middle child, was sharper, too smart for the small mountain town but too scared to leave it. She spent most of her time helping her mother, though sometimes she'd drive alone at night, headlights cutting through the dark back roads for hours, no one knowing where she went. Elijah, the youngest, was quiet in a different way. There was something fragile about him, something broken that never got fixed. He followed his father around like a shadow, always eager to please, always afraid to disappoint. To outsiders, the Ridges were private but respectable. They went to church on Sundays, brought casseroles to funerals, and waved from their truck when passing neighbors on the road. But those who lived nearby noticed things that didn't sit right. The way Warren's temper could turn in an instant. The way Caleb's bruised knuckles never seemed to heal. The way Ruth's laughter never reached her eyes. There was tension in that house, thick enough to taste, but no one spoke of it. In the Appalachians, family business stayed behind closed doors. The first sign that something was wrong came in whispers. A hiker had gone missing not far from the Ridge property, a young man from out of state passing through with a backpack and a camera. The sheriff's department organized a small search, but the woods were endless, and people went missing in those parts all the time. The case went cold within weeks. Life went on as it always did. But those who knew the Ridges started to notice how Warren seemed calmer after the disappearance, almost satisfied. There was also the way the family's luck suddenly changed. Caleb bought a new truck, started wearing nicer clothes. Even the house, long left to rot, got a fresh coat of paint. When someone asked Caleb where the money came from, he just smiled and said, "Hard work is finally paying off." But deep down, everyone knew there weren't many honest ways to make that kind of money in those mountains anymore. Still, no one said a word. Not then. The Ridges had a way of making people keep their distance. It wasn't just fear. It was the quiet understanding that if you looked too closely, you might see something you could never unsee. By the time the second person went missing, the town's silence had become complicity. People convinced themselves it was a coincidence, bad luck, anything but the truth. But deep in the hollow, in that leaning farmhouse with its flickering lights and locked cellar door, the Ridges were building something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The fog thickened, the woods stayed quiet, and the mountains kept their secret at least for a little while longer. By the time spring came around, the fog had lifted from the valley but not from the ridge house. The winter had been long, the kind that makes the walls feel closer every day, and by March, the family's tempers were wearing thin. Caleb spent most of his time out on the road, hauling scrap and taking odd jobs in nearby towns. When he came home, the smell of gasoline and whiskey followed him through the door. Warren didn't say much, but the quiet between father and son had started to sound more like a threat than peace. Money was running low again. Whatever fortune they had stumbled upon after the hiker disappeared had started to dry up. The new truck's engine was making strange noises, and the bills from the repair shop piled up in a drawer by the sink. Kept asking Warren about selling some of the scrap in the yard, but he'd just shake his head and tell her to mind her place. There was something he wasn't saying, something that made him restless. He'd sit up at night smoking on the porch, eyes fixed on the dark tree line like he was waiting for something or someone. Ruth had grown tired of pretending everything was fine. She had always been close to her mother, but lately had become distant, distracted by whispers from Warren that Ruth couldn't quite catch. She began to notice the small things, the cellar door being locked more often, the strange stains on her father's boots, the way Caleb's hands shook when he poured a drink. Ruth wasn't naive. She'd heard the stories about her father when she was younger, stories about men who crossed him and disappeared, about money that came from nowhere and secrets buried in the woods. Still, part of her wanted to believe he was just a hard man trying to survive. That illusion was starting to crumble. One evening, as the wind howled through the mountains, Ruth found Elijah sitting by the creek behind their property. He was tossing stones into the water, face pale and drawn. When she sat beside him, he didn't look at her. After a long silence, he muttered, "Pa made me help him dig again last night." Ruth froze. "Dig what?" she asked, Elijah's jaw tightened. "He said it was just a hole for the new fence post, but it was. He told me not to ask." He looked at her then, his eyes wide and wet. "I think there was something already buried there." That night, Ruth lay awake, staring at the ceiling while her parents' voices drifted through the thin walls. They were arguing again, tone pleading, Warren's sharp and controlled. She caught fragments. "You said it was over, we can't keep doing this, someone will notice." Then came silence, followed by the sound of footsteps leaving the house. Warren's truck engine started, then faded into the distance. Over the next few weeks, tension seeped into every part of their lives. Caleb started spending his nights in town, drinking and gambling with men who didn't like to be owed money. Rumors spread that he'd gotten into a fight at the bar and left a man bleeding on the floor. When Warren heard about it, he didn't yell. He just stared at his son for a long, heavy moment and said, "You'd better fix it before I have to." The way he said it made Caleb's hands tremble. Meanwhile, Ruth began keeping notes, small, folded scraps of paper she hid beneath her mattress. She wrote down everything she saw and heard, things that didn't make sense, things she was afraid she'd forget. She didn't know what she planned to do with them, but something inside her told her the truth needed to be remembered, even if no one ever saw it. Tried to keep the peace, but her strength was fading. The bruises on her arms were harder to hide, and her voice shook when she spoke. She stopped going into town altogether, afraid someone might notice how bad things had become. Her world had shrunk to the walls of that creaking house, where every door seemed to hide a secret. Then came the stranger. A man named Frank, a state investigator sent to look into a series of missing persons reports in the area. He showed up at the general store asking questions, polite, calm, but persistent. Folks told him about hikers gone missing, about hunters who never came back, about the strange family that lived near the ridge. The Ridges didn't hear about him until the next day, when Caleb came home, slamming the door behind him. "A man is asking about us," he said, packing the floor. "He's from the state, says he's just passing through, but he ain't fooling anyone." Warren didn't react. He just sat there sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape filling the room. "Then don't give him a reason to keep asking," he said softly. "People who dig too deep around here usually end up buried." Flinched at his words, but no one spoke. Frank stopped by their property 2 days later. Warren met him on the porch, friendly enough but firm. The investigator asked a few questions about the land, about the hikers, and about whether Warren had seen anything unusual. Warren answered each one calmly, his voice even. But when Frank asked to look around the property, Warren's smile vanished. "This here's private land," he said. "Ain't nothing out there but dirt and trees." The two men stared at each other for a long moment before Frank tipped his hat and left. After he was gone, Warren called his sons outside. No one knows what was said that evening, but the shouting carried through the woods. Later, Ruth saw Caleb throwing tools into the truck bed, his face pale and tight. Elijah stood by the steps, shaking. Whatever Warren had told them, it wasn't something that could be undone. In the days that followed, the air around the Ridge home seemed charged, like a storm waiting to break. Warren and Caleb were gone most nights and spent her time sitting by the window, her hands gripping a rosary that had lost its shine. Ruth tried to talk to her, but just whispered, "Don't ask questions, baby. It's safer that way." Then one morning, Ruth woke to find Elijah gone. His room was empty, his bed still warm. Warren claimed he'd gone to stay with relatives for a while, but Ruth didn't believe him. Elijah wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. That evening, she followed the trail down to the creek, the same spot where she'd found him weeks before. There in the soft mud by the water, she saw the faint outline of boot prints, 2 sets, one small, one larger, and beside them a dark stain that hadn't yet washed away. Ruth ran home, her heart pounding. When she burst through the door, Warren was waiting. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He just looked at her, eyes cold and flat. "You need to stop poking around in things you don't understand," he said. "Family comes first, remember that." That night, Ruth packed a small bag. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. But when she went to leave, the front door was locked from the outside. Warren's voice came from the dark hallway behind her. "Ain't nobody leaving this house until I say so." From that moment on, the Ridge home stopped pretending to be normal. The air felt thick with dread, every sound. Ruth could hear Caleb arguing with their father late into the night, words like money, mess, and body slipping through the cracks in the walls. Had stopped talking altogether, moving through the house like a ghost. Frank came back one final time, unannounced, late in the evening. His car headlights cut through the mist as he walked up the path, clipboard in hand. Inside the house, Warren stood by the window, watching. "He's here again," Caleb muttered, voice shaking. Warren didn't move. "Then I guess it's time we take care of it," he said. And somewhere deep in the woods, where the ground was still fresh from the last storm, the earth waited for what came next. The Ridge family had reached their breaking point. The line between survival and sin had vanished completely, leaving only fear, blood, and the quiet whisper of the mountains watching from the dark. The night the Ridge family finally broke was darker than usual. The fog hung low, thick enough to swallow the trees whole, and the wind carried the sharp scent of rain and pine. The old farmhouse sat at the edge of the ridge, its porch light flickering like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the air was heavy, tense enough that every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. Sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped tightly around a chipped mug she hadn't touched in hours. Ruth stood near the window, watching the distant headlights wind slowly up the dirt road. She knew those lights. It was Frank. He was coming back again, this time without warning, and something inside her told her that he wouldn't be leaving the same way he came. Caleb was packing near the fireplace, jaw clenched, muttering under his breath. "He's not gonna stop, Pa, you should handled it the first time." Warren stood by the door, staring out into the night. His voice, low and cold, filled the room. "We handle it tonight." Looked up sharply, her voice trembling. "Warren, please, don't do this, there's still time to make it right." But he didn't answer, he just turned, his eyes flat and emotionless. "It's already done." Outside, the crunch of gravel announced Frank's arrival. The car engine cut off, leaving only the sound of frogs in the distance. Frank stepped out, adjusting his coat, flashlight in hand. He didn't know it yet, but 3 pairs of eyes were already watching him from the darkened windows. He knocked on the door once, twice. "Mr. Ridge," he called out, "I just have a few follow-up questions, won't take long." Inside, no one moved. Caleb looked at his father. "What's the plan?" he whispered. Warren took a slow breath and nodded toward the back door. "You go around, don't let him leave." Caleb slipped out, the screen door groaning softly as it shut. Ruth's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint. She turned to her mother. "We have to stop this," reached for her, fingers trembling, but Warren's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Sit down." The front door opened with a creak. Frank stepped in cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the dim kitchen. "Mr. Ridge," he said again, scanning the room. Warren emerged from the shadows near the hall, his face calm, almost friendly. "Evening," he said. "You're out late." Frank gave a polite nod. "Sorry to bother you again. I just had a few more questions about your property. We've had another report. Someone heard gunshots in this area last month." Warren's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You sure it wasn't just hunters? A lot of folks out here, coyotes." Frank's gaze drifted toward the window. "Maybe, but I have to check every lead." His flashlight beam moved across the room and stopped on Ruth. She looked frozen, eyes wide and unblinking. "Evening, ma'am," he said softly, but before she could respond, Warren stepped between them. "She's got nothing to say to you," he said. His tone had changed, harder now, dangerous. Frank took a slow step back. His hand brushed the edge of his jacket where his holster was clipped. That small motion broke whatever was left of the fragile calm. From behind, Caleb appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his hands shaking. He was holding a shotgun. "Pa," he whispered. "I can't." "Do it," Warren hissed. Frank's hand went to his holster, but he wasn't fast enough. The sound of the gunshot shattered the night. The blast echoed through the house, rattling the windows. Frank stumbled backward, the flashlight clattering to the floor, its beam spinning wildly across the walls. Screamed, Ruth's knees buckled and she fell against the table. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, thick and metallic. Frank lay on the floor, gasping for breath, blood spreading across his chest. Caleb stood frozen, the gun slipping from his hands. "Oh God," he stammered. "Oh God, Pa, what did we do?" Warren moved toward the body, calm as ever. He knelt beside Frank, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. "He's gone," he said quietly. Then turning to his son, "You did what had to be done." Was sobbing now, shaking uncontrollably. "We can't hide this, Warren. They'll come looking for him." Warren stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Then we make sure they don't find anything to look for." He turned to Caleb. "Get the tarp." Ruth couldn't move, she couldn't speak. She just watched as her brother stumbled toward the barn, returning with the faded blue tarp they used for firewood. Warren wrapped the body like it was nothing more than another chore to finish before sunrise, tried to look away, but Warren's voice stopped her. "You're gonna help too." "Warren, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He grabbed her by the wrist, his grip iron tight. "You're part of this family. You don't get to walk away." Ruth snapped then. "He's dead because of you," she screamed. "All of this, every awful thing, you did this." Warren turned toward her, his face twisting with rage. "You don't know what it takes to survive in this world," he said. "You think anyone out there cares if we live or die? We take care of our own." For the first time, Ruth saw him for what he truly was, not just a cruel father, but a man completely hollowed out by his own fear and greed. There was no remorse in him, no hesitation, only control. They dragged Frank's body out into the rain, the ground soft beneath their boots. The flashlight beam bobbed through the darkness, catching the silver flash of water running down Warren's face. They stopped near the edge of the woods, where the earth had already been disturbed from past diggings. Ruth realized, with a sick twist in her gut, that this was where Elijah had been taken. As Warren and Caleb began to dig, stood motionless, her eyes vacant. Ruth tried to grab her hand, but pulled away. "He'll kill us if we don't help," she whispered. By the time the hole was deep enough, the rain had turned to a steady downpour. Mud clung to their boots, and the air smelled of rot and iron. Caleb was shaking so badly that he could barely hold the shovel. "I didn't mean to," he kept repeating. "I didn't mean to." Warren ignored him. Together, they lowered the body into the ground. When it was done, Warren wiped the rain from his face and looked at his children. "No one talks about this, ever, you hear me?" Ruth stared at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You can't bury everything, Pa." He stepped toward her, eyes burning. "Watch me." The 4 of them walked back to the house in silence. The porch light flickered again, casting long shadows across the mud. Inside, the clock ticked steadily, a cruel reminder that time hadn't stopped, even though everything else had. Sat back at the kitchen table, her hands still trembling. Caleb collapsed into a chair, staring at nothing. Warren poured himself a drink, as calm as if he'd just fixed a broken fence. "It's over," he said quietly. "We go on like normal." But Ruth knew it wasn't over. The silence in that room wasn't peace. It was rot, spreading through every corner of their lives. The storm outside raged on, wind slamming against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like a warning. In that moment, the Ridge family crossed the line completely. Whatever bit of humanity had been left inside that house drowned in the rain with the man they'd buried. And though the world outside remained quiet, the mountains had seen everything, and they never forget. The morning after the killing, the rain had stopped, but the ground around the Ridge property still looked wounded, mud torn up by boots, the earth darker where the water hadn't yet soaked through. The fog drifted low over the fields again, wrapping the house in silence. From the outside, it looked the same as it always had, quiet, isolated, forgotten. Inside, though, everything had changed. Caleb was the first to break. He didn't sleep that night, just sat in the barn staring at his hands, still stained with dirt. Every time he blinked, he saw Frank's face, the shock, the pain, the way the light had gone out of his eyes. By sunrise, his breathing had turned shallow, erratic. When found him there, he was muttering to himself. "He was just doing his job," he whispered. "He wasn't gonna hurt us." Knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she wiped the sweat from his forehead. "You have to stay calm," she told him softly, though her own voice was shaking. "If your father hears you talking like that—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Warren, on the other hand, was colder than ever. He woke early, made coffee, and went about his morning like nothing had happened. He burned the tarp, cleaned the gun, and scrubbed the floor where the blood had soaked into the wood. He moved with quiet precision, every motion practiced, like this wasn't the first time. When asked him what they'd do if someone came looking for Frank, he just said, "They won't." He didn't tell anyone he was coming. But Ruth knew that wasn't true. Investigators don't just disappear without a trace. Someone always looks. She spent the morning sitting on her bed, clutching the small stack of notes she'd been keeping, the scraps of paper with dates, names, and every strange thing she'd noticed in the months before. She read them over and over, her mind racing. She wanted to run, to tell someone what had happened, but the thought of her father's voice stopped her cold. You don't know what it takes to survive in this world. 2 days passed before the first signs of panic reached the town. Frank's car was found a few miles away, parked crooked on the side of an old mining road. The driver's door was open, the keys still in the ignition. People gathered at the general store to talk. Some said he must gotten lost in the woods. Others whispered darker things, that maybe he'd found something he wasn't supposed to. The sheriff organized a search, sending volunteers into the hills with flashlights and dogs. But the forest around the Ridge home was thick, endless, and the ground there had already been disturbed too many times. The Ridges watched the search parties from their porch. Warren stood like a statue, his expression unreadable, stayed inside, too sick to leave her bed. Caleb refused to go near the window. Ruth felt her chest tighten every time she saw the flash of a flashlight in the trees. It was only a matter of time before they found the wrong spot. That night, as the searchers' lights faded into the distance, Ruth confronted her father. "They're going to find him," she said. Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. "You can't hide this forever." Warren didn't look up from his chair. "You think I haven't been through worse," he said quietly. "You think the law scares me. You killed a man, Pa." His eyes met hers, calm and cold. "We did what we had to. You think that man would stop? You think he cared about us? He was going to ruin everything this family had built." Ruth's voice cracked. "You built this on blood." He stood then, his height towering over her. "You don't understand what it means to protect your own. One day you will." But Ruth didn't want to understand. That night she took her mother's car keys and crept outside, the gravel crunching softly under her shoes. She didn't know where she was going, just away. But when she turned the ignition, the headlights flared on and the front door opened. Warren stepped into the yard, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. "You think you can just walk away?" he said, his voice low. Ruth froze, appeared behind him, her face pale and hollow. "Warren, please," she whispered. "She's scared, let her go." He stared at Ruth for a long time, then slowly lowered the gun. "You go," he said finally. "But if you talk to anyone, if you bring them here, I'll bury you right next to him." Ruth drove off into the dark, tears blurring her vision, the mountain road twisting beneath her tires. She didn't stop until she saw the glow of town lights. But when she tried to speak to the sheriff, her courage broke apart. She could barely breathe, barely think. All she managed to say was that she hadn't seen the investigator lately. That was all, nothing more. She left the station shaking, knowing she'd just damned herself by staying silent. In the weeks that followed, the story of Frank's disappearance spread beyond the county. News crews arrived, setting up cameras along the main road. They interviewed locals, filmed the fog rolling over the mountains, and replayed old rumors about missing hikers. The Ridge's name came up again and again, never an accusation, but an uneasy suspicion. People who once greeted Warren with nods now crossed the street when they saw him coming. Rarely left her room anymore. She started talking to herself, whispering prayers that went unanswered. At night, Ruth could hear her crying softly, murmuring Elijah's name. Caleb spent most of his time drinking, haunted by what he'd done. One night, Ruth found him out by the creek, kneeling in the mud, staring at the water. "I see him every time I close my eyes," he said quietly. "He's just standing there, waiting." The sheriff returned to the Ridge house a month later with a warrant. He was polite but firm. They searched the barn, the cellar, and the woods out back. Warren stood by, his face calm, hands folded. They didn't find anything. The rain and the shifting earth had erased every trace. Before leaving, the sheriff looked at Warren for a long moment. "If you know anything, you ought to say so," he said. Warren just smiled. "If I did, I'd tell you." But the silence didn't last. Caleb couldn't hold it in anymore. The guilt was eating him alive, turning every night into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. 2 months after the killing, he showed up drunk at the sheriff's office. His words tumbled out through tears and shaking hands. "It was me," he said. "It was me, but he made me do it." The confession hit the town like a thunderclap. Within hours, deputies swarmed the Ridge property. Warren was arrested on the porch, his face blank as they cuffed him, screamed until her voice gave out. Ruth stood in the doorway, unable to move. It didn't feel real, none of it did. During questioning, Warren everything. He claimed Caleb was lying, that his son had lost his mind from drink. But the authorities dug up the field behind the Ridge house, and the truth finally came up with the dirt. They found Frank's remains, along with the bodies of 2 others who had gone missing years before, a hiker and a drifter who'd passed through town. The news spread fast. Reporters flooded the county, turning the quiet mountain town into a spectacle. The Ridges went from a strange but respected family to monsters in a matter of days. The headlines called them the Blood Ridge Clan. Neighbors who once shared meals with them now spoke of them with disgust, pretending they'd always known something was off. Never recovered, she refused to testify against her husband, but her health collapsed soon after the trial began. Caleb pleaded guilty, sobbing as the judge read his sentence. Ruth sat in the courtroom, her hands shaking, unable to look at either of them. Warren showed no emotion when the verdict came. Life without parole. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said, "Family first." After the sentencing, Ruth left the mountains. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. The house sat empty for months before someone finally tore it down. Locals said the ground there never grew grass again, that the soil stayed black no matter how much rain fell. In the years that followed, people still whispered about the Ridge family, about what drove them, about what kind of darkness could grow in a place so quiet. Some blamed poverty. Others blamed isolation. But those who'd lived near them, who'd seen Warren's cold stare and haunted eyes, said it was simpler than that. Some people are born with a kind of hunger that nothing can fill. And up in the Appalachian hills, where fog still curls through the trees and the air hums with old secrets, the wind sometimes carries the sound of a woman's voice, soft, broken, whispering a name that never got an answer. By the time the trial came to an end, the town of Pine Hollow was nothing like the quiet place it had once been. The roads that once held the hum of morning tractors and gossiping neighbors were now heavy with silence, as if the earth itself was still carrying the weight of what had happened. The once seen as the kind of family people whispered about with a mix of envy and respect were now nothing more than a warning. Their house stood like a scar on the mountain, boarded up and cold, the garden overgrown, the porch sagging. The courtroom had become the new stage for their downfall. People came from nearby counties just to sit in the back and watch. Some wanted to see justice served, others just wanted to see the famous family crumble. Sat there every day, dressed in black, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Caleb, her only son left, stood trial for the murder of his brother, and though he insisted it was self-defense, the jury saw through the lies that had kept their family afloat for years. The story the lawyers painted wasn't just about one violent night. It was about greed, control, and the kind of love that rots from the inside. When the verdict was read, Caleb didn't cry. He just stared ahead, lips trembling slightly, as if the words guilty were something he'd known would come long before they were spoken. Let out a sound that no one in that courtroom would ever forget. It wasn't a cry, not exactly, but a sound somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was a realization. For years, she had fought to protect her family name, but in the end, all she had protected was the lie that destroyed them. Caleb was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke of moral decay and choices made in the shadows. Reporters scribbled every word, eager to feed the nation's appetite for stories of fallen families and dark secrets. Outside, people whispered that they got what they deserved, that no one could live that high for so long without falling. But there were a few who still felt sorry, not for what Caleb had done, but for what he had been born into. After the trial, disappeared from the public eye. Some said she left Pine Hollow and moved in with her sister in Kentucky. Others claimed she still drove out to the old house at night, sitting in her car and staring at the empty windows. The land was eventually sold to an outsider who didn't know the history, but locals said no one ever stayed there long. Strange sounds, flickering lights, voices carried on the wind, it was all part of the legend now. The local paper kept running stories for months after the trial, opinion pieces about family values, justice, and the dangers of unchecked power. Preachers used the story in their sermons, talking about how pride leads to ruin and how no amount of money could buy peace of mind. But beneath the moralizing, there was something deeper that no one wanted to admit. Everyone in Pine Hollow had looked the other way for years. They accepted the money, their influence, their charm, and in doing so, they'd helped build the lie too. The tragedy became more than just a local crime. It was a mirror held up to the quiet rot beneath small-town decency. The story forced people to face how easily morality bends when power and fear are involved. They weren't just victims of their own cruelty, they were proof of what happens when a family starts believing they're untouchable, when love becomes possession, and when silence becomes survival. Caleb's letters from prison were sometimes printed in the paper. In them, he wrote not about innocence, but about guilt, not for the act itself, but for everything that led up to it. "You grow up believing family means protection," one of his letters read. "But when that protection starts to feel like a cage, you either break or you fight back, and sometimes fighting back means losing everything." Those words haunted the town for years. They made people think about their own lives, their own secrets, the arguments behind closed doors, the things they let slide because it was easier not to see. The case became a story people told their children when they wanted to teach them about pride, greed, and the slow poison of power. In the end, there was no real justice, not the kind that restores balance. Caleb's life ended behind bars, ended in isolation, and the town carried the memory like a scar. But the story lived on, passed down through generations, reshaped with every retelling. It became less about one family and more about what can happen to anyone when love turns to control and truth becomes a threat. Standing at the edge of the property now, years later, you can still feel something in the air, not ghosts, but memory. The trees have grown thick again, the grass hides the broken fence, and the wind moves through the valley with a low, sorrowful hum. Time has done its best to cover what happened, but the land remembers. It always does. The Deadliest Appalachian family you didn't know existed became a story not just of blood and betrayal, but of the quiet ways people destroy one another long before a crime is ever committed. It was about how love without honesty becomes a weapon, and how the pursuit of control, over others, over reputation, over truth, always ends the same way, with everything lost. And in that truth, buried deep in the Appalachian soil, the legacy remains not in wealth or power, but in warning.